So, welcome everybody to this session on the Americas. We've got a great panel today to talk about the situation in America and also in the Caribbean. So, what I thought we'd do, we'd kick off. We've got some very well-known speakers lined up today. So they will introduce themselves initially and give us a quick rundown on what the situation is currently in their destinations. So I think we'll start with His Excellency Edmund Bartlett, Minister of Tourism for Jamaica. Good morning, Minister Bartlett.
Good morning, Lee.
Yeah. Just start off by give a rundown on where we're at with travel into and out of Jamaica and the situation regarding COVID in your country currently.
Well, where we are in Jamaica is that we are just about a month into the phase one opening of the tourism sector in Jamaica. We've just come out of almost 4 months of shutdown, where previously we were earning some 3.7 billion US dollars, and we welcomed just a little over 4.3 million visitors. We were employing 354,000 people, which represented something of 22% of the Jamaica workforce. We were providing 60% of the foreign exchange to the country and accounted for some 9.5% of GDP. Now, all of that disappeared, as you know, somewhere around the 10th of March, where we began to have zero arrivals, zero earnings, on unemployment at a level that was unprecedented in our country. We also saw the building out of a whole new arrangement in terms of protocols now for how do you manage this virus. We had to shut down borders, as you know, and in the process we had to think out hard and long how to repatriate our Jamaicans who are different places in the world, and more so some of the workers of the cruise industry who were scattered across the seas of the world. So all of that is the sort of background to where we are today. We developed in the process, however, a very strong protocol, a series, in fact, of protocols, that, as well as algorithms as to how to manage this crisis. Much of it based on data, which we derive from managing and measuring the infection levels, the recovery level, the death rate, the hospitalization levels, as well as how do we deal with severe cases, and most importantly, testing mechanisms. So all of those enabled us to get to a level where Jamaica's infection rate, which is called the R0, came down to 0.7%. And we then were in a position where we could say, yes, let's begin to reopen our borders and let's begin to invite international visitors back to Jamaica. So in the last 4 weeks, we've brought in just a little over 12,000 visitors and earned, just a little over 15 million US dollars. So the end of this month, we should get to about 70 million US, and that's nice to see again that tourism is contributing to the foreign exchange development of Jamaica, and we would have brought back somewhere in the region of 20,000 workers. And just to make the point, because it is so important to us, I got a video message from one of the workers showing me the first visitor she was processing at her hotel. And the excitement in her voice was only surpassed by her own expression that this for her is hope. And it brought a little tear to my eyes, because I said, yes, that's what tourism does. It brings hope to people. And to bring back hope is to revive humanity, is to make you feel like somebody again. And I felt really like a new person when I heard that from the girl. Yeah.
So all hotels open now in Jamaica. We saw, obviously, you are on the list the British government has come up with, the places we can travel to. but I believe you've got a system in place where you have to fill in a questionnaire. So is everywhere open, and are there any restrictions about travel currently?
Well, we have established a Jamaica app called Jam COVID-19, and on that app are two platforms: one to admit Jamaican nationals coming home, and the other Visit Jamaica portal for international visitors. So a number of questions are asked, and including, of course, the C5 form, which is the normal immigration, to enable a seamless entry and to provide for a screening arrangement for us, so that we could decide who you test, who you allow to go to homestay, and who can go into what we have developed to be the tourism resilience corridor. And I want to spend a minute on that, if you allow me, because I think it's an innovation on our part, which is to enable a desired geographical area to be put aside, so to speak, where most of the tourism assets are for touristic activities, which doesn't allow for too much interaction now with the wider population. So this is a way of helping to keep the spread as low as possible.
Okay.
And so far, the hotels that operate in that corridor have to be what we call COVID resilient compliant. That is, they must fulfill all the touch points that we've established in the protocols. They must demonstrate that the COVID security equipment that are required are all present. It's hand sanitizers and all the other gadgetry. Then they must also have architectural arrangements to allow for physical distancing in their ballrooms, in their dining rooms, on the beach, around the pool, and all the public areas that the visitor will have to traverse. And finally, the workers. All the workers of those industries have to be well-trained, well-prepared, and outfitted with the necessary COVID security gadgetry. And we find that using that has done well for us so far. We have opened about 10 facilities so far, and it's continuing. Every day, a new one is opening.
Okay, good. Let's move on and hear about the situation in the United States with Roger Dow, who's President and Chief Executive of the US Travel Association. A big place in the US, and I'm sure it's a very complex picture. But give us a broad overview, Roger, of where you assess the US is in terms of the disease itself and the pandemic and prospects of opening up to travel again.
Good. Thanks, Lee. United States, just like every other country around the world, has been hit extremely hard by this COVID situation. To put it in perspective, the travel industry will lose 45% of its 2020 revenue. That's $520 billion with a B. But more serious is the unemployment associated with it. Travel, as we all know, is such a labor-intensive business. We in the United States have 15.8 million Americans get their job due to travel, and 8.1 million of those people have been out of work. So when you look at it, that's 51%. To put it in perspective, during the Great Depression, the worst year of the Great Depression was 25.5%. So the travel industry is dealing with twice what the level was in the Great Depression. So that's been a real problem. And not only has it hurt the travel industry with billions of dollars, but the travel industry is a front door to economic development. Nothing happens. People don't sell a product, decide to buy a second home, relocate a company, do a sales mission, select a university, perhaps. All those things start with travel. So travel is sort of like the link to the entire economy. So it's had a tremendously negative effect. We're opening regionally. We can talk about it in a few minutes. We're not open at all internationally. So it's basically a domestic game right now, and Elliott can probably bring it home more locally for you. Thanks.
Good stuff. Okay, thank you, Roger. And yeah, like you say, a massive impact. So Elliott, Washington's feeling it as much as anybody else. You're the CEO and President of Destinations DC. Been in the news recently, so we know about you a lot, but we can't go and visit there yet. So where are you at in terms of that development of getting back into tourism, probably domestically initially, and with the attempts to suppress the virus as well?
Well, good morning, Lee, and to the gentleman on the call. As Roger referenced, the U.S. as a whole is clearly feeling the effects of this pandemic. Washington is a city whereas tourism is not the largest economic engine for the city, but it's in the top 4, if you will, and one of the fastest growing with nearly 80,000 jobs, about $900 million in taxes, and over $8 billion plus in spend from visitors. As you can imagine, all those things have been compromised this year. Right now, Washington is in stage 2 of opening. I will say that the Washington community is one that respects what's being stated from our mayor and from science in terms of wearing masks. And we've been very fortunate to see declines in terms of the number of COVID cases. And we are slowly but surely seeing some positive news in terms of opening. Of course, the 4th of July was just celebrated. And even though our mayor stated, don't go to the mall, and we normally have hundreds of thousands of people in the mall, it was refreshing to see that the people that were out there. I live not far from the National Mall, and so my wife and I walked down to see the number of people that were out there. We're seeing museums that are starting to open again, the Spy Museum, the Museum of the Bible, Hillwood, and other major places in the greater Washington area. George Washington's home has reopened. And of course, with being in stage 2, we can do gatherings of 50 people or less, outside seating in restaurants, and about 50% of the dining capacity inside a restaurant. So we're very optimistic in terms of where we're going to go, but it clearly has been a very difficult road for our industry and for our city. Stage 2, outside of the US, we probably won't know what stage that means. We are all stages, and there's various protocols around the world. So what does stage 2 mean in the US? How many stages are there? Yeah, to put it in perspective, there are technically 4 stages. First stage was gatherings of 25 people or less. Stage 2 for us is 50 people or less. And if we continue to see the number of COVID cases decline, we'll enter into stage 3, which will allow us to have gatherings of 250 people. Okay. Now, these numbers are good from a leisure perspective, but the other part of what we do in Washington would be MICE meetings or large congresses. So from that perspective, it will be very difficult for us to realize what we've been seeing for the last few years in terms of a steady growth of large citywide conventions with 20 to 40,000 people coming into Washington. That won't happen until stage 4, which is tied to an actual vaccine being found. Okay. And you're on the road to that, but it's obviously slow progress. But that is meetings indoors and outdoors, is it? So that you can have mostly indoors. Yeah, it's and I say that simply because you see so many events from individuals coming to Washington to exercise their First Amendment right during the Black Lives Matter movement, folks outside on the mall during the 4th of July. So you see large gatherings of individuals outside, but still wearing masks and still practicing social distancing. But I won't suggest that it's not tied to being physically outdoors, because there are a lot of places in Washington that large groups can gather outdoors, but it's specific to being physically inside of a building. Okay. Our final speaker, let's move on to Greg, who isn't there representing a destination as such, but actually you're probably representing the planet. You're CEO of Tourism Cares, you're based in the US. So introduce yourself a little bit and say what you do in Tourism Cares, but a little bit about maybe, the impact that we've seen on the planet over the last 3 or 4 months, how that relates to tourism.
Absolutely, Lee. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm the CEO of Tourism Cares, as you mentioned. We're located here in Boston, and admittedly, I'm the outlier in this group in not representing a destination per se, but we have an almost 20-year history of representing the best interests of destinations, which we see as being tourism's greatest assets. So for me, it's really a matter here on this panel of ensuring that sustainability and resilience are part of this narrative, and in ensuring that there's really the proper balance in terms of how we kind of reemerge. As Roger mentioned, the economic impact is undeniable. But we have to talk about, as well, the lessons that we can learn from past incidents relative to over-tourism, relative to single-use plastics and the effect on the environment, and try to incorporate that into these plans going forward.
Yeah. Okay, look, let's talk a little bit now about the fact that travel is starting to open up, and it's happening patchy all over the world, and there are various different protocols going on. Roger, maybe come to you on this one initially. We're dealing with air bridges and quarantines and all these kind of rules and regulations. Are you satisfied that decisions are being made on a kind of rational, science-based, science leading the thinking? Or is politics coming into play a little bit here, do you think, in terms of where people are allowed to travel to and the kind of restrictions that we're seeing and going to be seeing for the foreseeable future?
I think right now, as I'm listening to various leaders in countries, they're basing their rhetoric and their decisions on the reality and the science. I do get concerned that politics can enter into these things when one country says you can't travel to my country and the other country says, well, okay, we'll do the same to you. That's a dangerous, very slippery slope, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. Right now, we're looking at the science. The reason that various restrictions have been put in is because of spikes in COVID, et cetera. So right now, I remain optimistic that our politicians will pretty much stay the course and look at it on a scientific medical basis. But I know politicians, and I always concerned that it could go the other way.
Yeah, obviously in the States, there you've got very strong state governmental, rules and regulations, and they run their own states. Are they working together collaboratively, do you feel, or is there some friction and some tension there between?
The states are, for the most part, working independently and collaboratively with each other. I will say, though, just recently, in the last week and a half or so, the states of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut said they were going to ban travel, or not ban travel, but put restrictions, a quarantine of 14 days to folks from about 10 or 11 states, and the list grows, and they're basing that on the number of COVID cases. And I think that is a dangerous precedent when one state says you can't travel from this state or that state to our state because of numbers. So I think they've got to be very smart in following the protocols, be safe, wear the mask, do all the right things. But shutting down a state to other states, I think, is a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, Elliott, let's bring you in on that. You're one of those states. How do you protect the people in your state and yet still try and open up to outsiders who might want to come in and visit?
Yeah, just to correct you a little bit, we're not a state actually, but we're surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. We'd love to be the 51st state, but that's another topic. But the reality is, when you look at Washington as a destination, during the workday, you have, our population is only about 700,000 people, which is shocking to so many because they think we're much larger. During the work week, that number basically increases significantly with people coming from Maryland and Virginia. So to Roger's point, as each state is basically similar to an individual country, our mayor is our governor. And it's very important that the governors of Maryland and Virginia, as well as our mayor, talk on a regular basis, simply because we're always going into Maryland, Virginia, and vice versa. So it's one of those things where we are very cautious and concerned about what's happening in other parts of the U.S. As Roger referenced, what's happening from an international perspective of not allowing U.S. citizens to travel is concerning. But at the same time, there are certain realities about who will actually travel internationally right now. We're hoping that we'll be able to get our act together in terms of some of the things that you all are seeing on TV internationally, and really focus on the science and the medicine tied to wearing a mask and doing the right things, because that's what we're focusing on as we're looking at ways to recover from this pandemic.
Yeah, I guess one of the hard things, Elliott, is there's been various different approaches to lockdown. Some extremely strict, some not so strict. All countries have taken a slightly different approach, and within the US, different states have taken a different approach. And there's a feeling that if you haven't done a really strict lockdown, you're a risk. But actually, that in some ways, the jury is out on how lockdowns did work and how they should work in the future in terms of suppressing the virus. So it's very difficult to make a judgment call on how a country or a state has really approached the lockdown scenario so far. We're still in the middle of this, aren't we?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but I will say that, even if the number of cases were dropping in the same way that they're dropping in DC, we would strongly recommend, as a matter of fact, it would be basically enforced that you will wear a mask if you're physically in a building in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, you're not seeing that around the country. So as we're looking at ways of recovery, and we've got about 50 million people that live within 250 miles of Washington. And as we're looking at recovery, we're banking on those individuals coming to a city that has over 100 free things to do, including the zoo and 16 Smithsonian museums that will eventually reopen. So the criteria will be for those coming in, everyone will be required to wear a mask. And if you choose not to wear a mask for whatever reason, you're probably going to be asked to leave a venue. It won't be, we as I've seen internationally, some of the videos that are going rampant in terms of what's happening. It won't be egregious, but it will be very clear that you have to wear a mask if you're physically in a building as we're looking at reopening in Washington.
Yeah. Okay. Minister Bartlett, you mentioned before, that you underlined the value of tourism to your country, and you talked about the protocols that you've put in place and new ways of operating. When you see how the world starts opening up, do you see politics playing a part in that a little bit? And is there a danger for the travel industry that they get a bit ahead of themselves and they encourage travel again, and that becomes once again a vector for spreading the virus to places that currently don't have it or have low levels? We've got to be careful about opening up and take a cautious approach.
Yes. Well, Lee, I think that the geopolitics of our time is going to play some role, and doubtlessly it is. But I think we're driven largely by the science and data now, and markets. And Jamaica, for example, and we in the Caribbean. So we've looked at how do you, for example, establish bubbles, travel bubbles, looking at countries that have managed COVID in a particular way, and who have, in our mind, established some high level of resilience, and whose algorithms are similar in terms of everything to ours. So the Caribbean, for example, became our first bubble. And we see similar arrangements in Europe and even in Oceania, Australia and New Zealand and so on. And then you look secondly at to build bridges, air bridges. And we're now looking at how we could do that with, say, Canada, for example, that has a similar now type of profile in terms of how they've managed the crisis. The US, for us, is our main market. And so we have to manage that process well. This is a marketing decision that you have to take where the US is concerned. So notwithstanding the higher risk, then we put in higher screening. And we say that we require pre-testing from certain states, or we require that everybody who's coming from high-risk areas to be tested with PCR on arrival to Jamaica. So that's how we're looking at managing this whole range, to protect ourselves, to protect our visitors, to recognize that there are a number of variables that are at work at this time. Some are political, but in our own experience, we're trying to downplay that and to focus more on the science and data and the market arrangements. And I think that those are what are guiding the heavy tourism-dependent regions on Earth, particularly small and medium enterprise countries and destinations, such as us here in the Caribbean.
Yeah. I guess, Greg, it's important as this process goes on that countries balance, the commercial realities that they need to get, these countries need to get tourism back again with the impact. I mean, and obviously the impact of the environment has been something that you're interested in, but we're talking here about an impact on people's health as well. So actually we're learning that impact is very important. And maybe what comes out of this is a better understanding of the impact of tourism. Do you feel that is the case? And you hope that will be the case as we leave this crisis.
Oh, absolutely, Lee. And, I would just kind of preface the fact that, while there's a very strong focus on, the environmental issues, when we look at sustainability as a whole, and in particular, the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which Tourism Cares uses as guideposts, those go well beyond just the green aspect of sustainability. And it's important really right now, as you mentioned, for destinations to really kind of maintain their sense of place during this whole thing. It is a balancing act, trying to encourage tourism policies and business practices that also protect and benefit the natural, scenic, and cultural assets of those destinations. So, you want to balance these issues of safety and hygiene with, enhancing your destination identity and your distinctiveness, and as well as putting a spotlight on your local communities and focusing on, the health and well-being of the local communities.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of expectation, and I think Roger will attest this in a minute when we move to it, that domestic travel will come back first. So when we talk about the US, it's going to be into US interstate movements. Does that help? Do you think that people traveling within their own regions travel in a more conscious way because it is ultimately their country? Do you think that's maybe one of the sort of the trends that will emerge from this, that we will come to respect the places we go to a bit more potentially?
Yeah, I hope so. I think that's a great, first step. I mean, I think one of the things that comes out of this pandemic is an opportunity to, all the different words have been stated, whether it's reset, rebalance. And the reality right now is that there will be a very strong emphasis on domestic travel. So, for instance, the various legislation that's going through right now to try to enhance and improve our infrastructure, of our roads, our bridges, and the like, is going to be very important relative to this particular trend. But as you mentioned, and I mentioned before, that whole sense of place and enhancing that kind of that distinctiveness of the destination. And I'm not sure exactly what the statistic is, but I had read once before that in many, many other countries, the percentage of their residents who actually visited their national parks was much greater than in the United States. So I know that a lot of people will take this opportunity to visit the national parks and really, delve into America's history.
Roger, I mean, domestic travel is also very important, and it's always been important in the US market because of the size of the country, and people can move around large distances without leaving the border. But presumably, the US needs to bring back that international travel, that high value international traveler. How do you see that market reviving in the long term? Things like bringing back the air that's needed. There's attraction there. You're going to need back those routes. So what is the US going to do to bring back that high value traffic?
Well, you put it in perspective, Lee, that international travel is extraordinarily important. It's 80 million international visitors last year, down to 0 this year. That's not very good at the present time. Those people spent $285 billion. It's a $60 billion positive balance of trade, meaning we spend less elsewhere than people spend here. So it's very important. It's important to bring back the China market. 3 million Chinese have visited here, up from 300,000 10 years ago. Those 3 million Chinese spend more than the 22 million Canadians, which we love the Canadians coming here, but the Chinese spend a lot more because they stay longer. A lot of Canadians are short trips, etc. So to bring it back, I think it's going to come back in the reverse order that it was shut down. So Canada, Mexico will come back first, UK, Ireland, Caribbean, areas like that next. Then finally, we'll start with international, but with Asia and China probably last, which we're going to have to do an awful lot. And I think things that are going to happen that are going to help that a lot are going to be testing, are going to be common protocols around the world, travel. So we know that someone coming from one country has gone through the same protocols that they're doing in their country, that we're doing in our country. So this has become more apparent than ever that we're in a global game here, and we all have to be working together and doing the same thing if we're to bring back international travel, not just for the US, but for Jamaica, for everywhere around the world. I mean, and the last piece is the air capacity. Right now, so many planes are parked, and they're operating such diminished capacity, and everybody fights for capacity. One of the challenges I know the minister will have is bringing back air capacity to Jamaica, because Jamaica depends on capacity, and everyone is going to be trying to get that capacity back again. And that's really the key to getting international travel going is getting that air capacity back.
Yeah. What's your expectation on the impact on the aviation sector commercially? I mean, it's very important that they get people on board who turn left and going to Elliott's destination for those MICE meetings, I guess.
Well, without air, we don't have a travel market. Domestic travel by car, we call it the Great American Road Trip, has come back. Auto travel this past weekend was only down about 15% since last year, while air traffic was down up to 75%. So that's going to be a long time coming back. The other thing that people aren't thinking about is we have to look at corporate travel policies. When COVID happened, most companies in the United States quickly said, don't travel, don't go to meetings. And we've got to, through the right protocols and safety measures, unravel those policies or people won't travel again. So without air, we don't have a travel industry. Simple as that.
Well, let's bring in the minister, just because you mentioned the importance of air to Jamaica. Minister Bartlett, what's the outlook in terms of airlift to Jamaica then? Do you fear there'll be a lack in the near term?
Well, Lee, so far so good. One of the advantages of opening up relatively early is that you get the saying, early bird get the worms. So far, the airlift arrangements for Jamaica have been quite good. We've gotten back, American Airlines, their flight schedules have, come back, not to normal, but we're coming back. And all the legacy carriers out to the US are back in Jamaica so far in the last month. We're getting British Airways is also back in the UK. Virgin is also back. TUI is back. And so we're looking now to see what's going to happen out of South America, as those have not yet come back. Yeah. So far, the airlift arrangements have been good. But, the big point that was made about how the Caribbean, and we haven't spoken about the Caribbean. I've spent a little time on Jamaica, but you know what? I'm a very, very deep-seated Caribbean man. And we represent the most tourism-dependent region on earth. If you notice in the Untitled report that just came out, among the countries that are heavily impacted by COVID are the Caribbean countries, and Jamaica leads that in the context. So coming back for us is very important. And a number of the Caribbean countries are already opening, as you could see, but we are opening also with some new ideas. And one of the new ideas is about how do you get a special type of traveler to now come into our space that deal with doing business from home and utilizing virtual experiences to literally transact business from the beach cottages in our destination. Barbados is leading in that innovation. And Jamaica is looking at how do we establish greater levels now of resilience and to establish logistic arrangements that enables the building out of capacity and the strengthening of our human capital to deliver a new type of tourism and to respond to a new type of traveler that we have called the Generation COVID, Generation C or Gen C. And this generation, of course, is going to be characterized by all these characteristics that we've mentioned earlier. The type of travel that's going to be focusing on social distances, focusing on wearing masks, dealing with a new way of managing relationships. And more importantly, we are going to have to train our workers to be able to deal with this new type of visitor. So it is about building capacity, and we're trying to establish, for example, in Jamaica here, what we're calling a tourism supplies logistics hub, where we're going to be training and building out capacities for a higher level of employment within the tourism industry, to move away from the traditional concept that tourism is about low-paying jobs, that tourism is about casual work, and now to take into technologies and how the Internet of Things are going to influence the way tourism is presented and services are provided and experiences are developed, and to build that capacity in Jamaica to be utilized by all in the Caribbean elsewhere. So I think that there are two takeaways that we're seeing out of all of this COVID experience. One is that we could look at a new type of visitor now in terms of those who would want to come to the Caribbean transact business and to operate their internet arrangements from the cottages on the beach in Jamaica on a long staying basis. And companies like Amazon and Facebook are beginning to say to their people, yes, we will allow you to go and to do it from the Caribbean anywhere once we're able to have delivery of what the goods that we need. And secondly, to understand the new visitor by way of the new mindset, the new demographic that is going to emerge, and how to make sure that destination assurance and health security are big factors to enable those visitors to come. And last, of course, is to deal with the whole business of resilience building and capacity building on the human side to create a job and skill set that is going to move tourism value added to another level, and to make tourism have a new look and a new feel, and that people will see us more as a true industry rather than as a social activity from which you earn the money.
Yeah. So I guess to go back to Elliott and to take on what Edmund just said about changing getting reassurance back to people to travel and that airlift issue. So I suspect Washington won't have an airlift issue being a major global city, but it is that reassurance that people who come to your city are going to be safe, the protocols are in place. So is that do you feel that's part of what your job is now, is to provide reassurance so people come and they feel they're safe and can be protected while they're there?
Well, I think the reality is people are going to feel safer going to destinations whereas they're seeing people practicing safe protocol. Mm-hmm. They'll see it in Washington. They see it on our website in terms of things in which we make sure that they're aware of what will have to happen when they're coming into Washington, D.C. You know, as the minister said, I've been watching all my friends on Facebook. My dad's from the Bahamas. They're seeing a return to of visitors from the U.S. there because of the opportunity to social distance, and the same with Jamaica and so many other Caribbean destinations. So that's, you know, the reality is, you know, the more individuals feel safe, you know, consumer confidence will continue to increase. There are certain realities for us, as I referenced, the number of people being able to drive into Washington, D.C. For the minister, it's the number of the short-term flights from certain parts of the U.S. to Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, which makes it consumers feel a lot more confident if the flight is shorter. So I think the key thing for us is to continue to focus on safety, but safety is a two-way street. You know, we have to be very mindful, or visitors have to be very mindful of the fact that we're equally as concerned for those that work in the industries here, those of us who are Washingtonians. So it's a new world tied to not, you know, should you, or maybe you don't have to. It's more along the lines that you must. And as well as the fact that, you know, our gyms opened up 2 weeks ago. The protocol now going into certain environments in Washington, D.C. are so stringent and so appreciated that you feel more comfortable in going back into establishments in Washington. And that's going to have to happen around the U.S., especially if they expect to see visitors coming back to their cities.
Yeah. Greg, what do you think this does to the way people plan and dream about their future travels? Do you think we're going to see a change in that, and that new factors will come into play when they think about what they want to do in the future?
Yeah, I think we've touched on so much of that already. I mean, just what Elliott was saying too is kind of maintaining that proper balance, which is so difficult. I think the ecosystem, as we've seen, is just so fragile. But I think we also have to really redefine what economic success is. I mean, we always talk about, you know, 10% of the global GDP. We talk about, you know, the number of travelers that are going to a particular destination. But I think beyond just GDP growth, you know, you have to look at things as Elliott was referencing in DC, for instance, small business development and, you know, and proper income distribution, which the minister, you know, referenced, and just really having strong, inclusive, you know, local supply chains. So I think, you know, you build in all of those factors. I mean, it's just a tremendous balance right now, but I think we have to see this as an opportunity first and foremost, because this is the opportunity to integrate those aspects into future economic success. As the minister said, the Generation C is going to think differently, and the statistics have borne out that people are willing to pay more if sustainability is taken into account, whether that's by whoever the supplier or the tour operator is. So I think we're seeing a different type of thinking and a different type of mentality that's coming into play. But it's really going to create the necessity to balance it all out.
Yeah, I want to finish. We've got 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to finish on 2 other issues that aren't COVID related, but maybe related to travel and tourism. So during the last 3 months, one of the other big things that's happened in the world is the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been focused in the US, but has gone absolutely global. Every major city in the world, I think, has seen some sort of focus on this. So maybe, Greg, just very briefly first, do you think that's going to be a factor going forward? It's can maybe change people's understanding of what tourism is, and it should do, and where you would travel to?
Well, as I mentioned at the onset, if we can learn from past lessons, and it may not seem like the over-tourism reference, would be apt, example. But if you think about it, what it did was it created social conflict. It created social conflict between local communities who were actually pushing against, or, were not receiving travelers and tourists coming into their country because they were tired of, their city or their country being essentially overtaken by tourism. So that aspect of social conflict comes into play when we look at DEI and racial injustice issues. And really how well a community is addressing that, I think, will come into play in terms of travelers, booking trends going forward. They, as Elliott says, they want to go to a place where they feel safe and secure. But they also want to go to places where, there's a certain like-mindedness in terms of, the thought process relative to, DEI issues and the like. They want to go to places where there's going to be a feeling of inclusiveness. Yeah.
And Elliott, with Washington being a kind of a focus for some of this activity as well, it could be that Washington becomes a place where certain people want to come to feel part of that in some way, or to make their point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a reoccurring position for Washington for years as the nation's capital. We are always appreciative of the fact that people come here to exercise their First Amendment right. Our mayor clearly made a bold statement with the Black Lives Matter Plaza on 16th Street in front of the White House, which has become somewhat of an attraction. You're also seeing the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, August 28th, and there being a recognized march being established by that will be happening in Washington, which will generate thousands of room nights. And as a matter of fact, arguably, it might be the last time in 2020 that the city will be sold out based on an event that brings people to Washington. So, we're clearly, as a nation, I appreciate what the minister does with the United Nations World Tourism Organization, because the thing I appreciate the most about tourism is that it gives us a chance to travel to different destinations and appreciate what is different about each culture and each person, but also educate and celebrate the things that we see that are alike. And in Washington, D.C. and in the U.S., we're really focusing on an age-old issue tied to the Black community and some disparities. And I applaud Roger Dow and the U.S. Travel Association, because we've been having webinars within our industry to really focus on some of these issues and to really dig a little deeper from the perspective of some of the disparities in the Black community that exist. Yeah. So in Washington, D.C., with our mayor, with our leadership, and with people coming from all over the U.S. and globally coming to Washington, D.C. to really focus on an issue that's existed in America for over 400 plus years is a big deal. And, the economics behind it clearly means that we'll see some uptick in visitors coming to the city. People will be employed, restaurants will be full, and that's a positive for us as a destination.
Yeah. Roger, your thoughts on how this impacts travel and tourism and people's decisions, but also we're in the throes of an election over there in the US, and that's only going to put the focus even more on the politics, which we started talking about, and whether people think there's going to be some sort of Trump effect. People have talked about the Trump effect in the US for years, ever since Trump became president. Is there really one? And do you think this is going to have an effect?
No, it's certainly going to be a factor in the legislative and electoral discussions. Again, Elliott mentioned U.S. travel. Elliott is actually, as our national chair, has taken a huge leadership role and brought back, we have several webinars, and Lee, we're talking 2,000 people got on these webinars and more to talk about this issue. And it goes beyond travel and tourism. It really gets to the fabric of who do we promote, how do we hire, how do we create opportunity, and Elliott's been very helpful to put a spotlight on it. Now we've got to move it beyond that rhetoric to reality.
Yeah, okay. We do have to close things up there. I just wondered if we'd just finish off with Mr. Minister Bartlett. Just a quick thought, you know, as you've watched things unravel from the Caribbean point of view, about your views on where the Black Lives Matter movement is in terms of its impact on travel and tourism for a country like Jamaica, which you know, because of the issues being raised, is very much at the heart of what people are talking about.
Yeah, you know, Lee, I think, and I don't want to make it appear as though the Caribbean thinks that it can be a net beneficiary of this global move, but we in the Caribbean have prided ourselves in the fact that we are a very inclusive archipelago of peoples. We are in fact a confluence of cultures and ethnicity, as you would appreciate. Every nation on earth is in the Caribbean. And we have very, very narrow distinction. Indeed, we have blurred lines in terms of races and color in the Caribbean. But we do have issues of social stratification, which we have to deal with. And in that context, questions of inequality and justice are very big on our agenda. But we want to position ourselves as a place where everyone can come and feel that Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, is very important to us all. The whole business of enabling us to see how races live harmoniously. I think it's a model that we in the Caribbean can offer to the world, that we have, and the Jamaica's motto is out of many one people. And so we have that melting pot of different groups, and we treat people with respect. And so Black Lives Matter in the Caribbean, and that's a big point. But the Caribbean is also saying that everybody is very important, and tourism is that vehicle that should make that message very strong and should carry that message across the world, that we are that activity globally that brings people together, that creates a sense of equity and equality, and that recognizes diversity but celebrates differences while it embraces similarity. So this is what we are, and I'm very proud that tourism can become that carrier, that vehicle that will transform the thinking of the world and to make people recognize each other better, have greater respect for each other, and hopefully to make a peaceful world.
Lovely stuff. I think on that note, we'll draw a close to today's session. So thank you guys for joining us. Very happy to have Minister Bartlett, who I think is off to a cabinet meeting now. So very thanks for your time. I know it's hard to get you on these things, but so thank you to Edmund Bartlett. Thank you very much to Elliott from DC. A big thanks to Roger Dow, and of course to Greg from Tourism Cares. Thanks for your time, guys. We hope that was interesting, and I think it's now time to hear a few final words from today's organisers. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Lee.
Thank you.